The macabre history of Las Poquianchis reveals the darkest chapter in Mexico's criminal past. A tale of four sisters who killed more than 90 women in their brothel. But this isn't just another true crime story. This is the forbidden history that authorities tried to bury, a secret so horrifying that it took decades for the full truth to emerge. Picture this: Rancho El Angel, a remote ranch in Guanajuato, 1964. Police dig shallow graves under the scorching sun while townsfolk whisper in disbelief. Over 90 bodies, maybe 200. The ground remembers what the Gonzalez Valenzuela sisters tried to hide. But how did four women from poverty become Mexico's most prolific killers? How did their brothel become a graveyard that swallowed entire generations? The Delfina, Maria del Carmen, Maria Luisa, and Maria de Jesus didn't start as monsters. They started as survivors in a world that offered them nothing but hunger and abuse. What began as a desperate escape from poverty transformed into an empire built on fear, exploitation, and death. For over a decade, Rancho El Angel operated as both brothel and prison, where young women vanished without a trace. Police looked the other way. Politicians took bribes. Families searched in vain for daughters who would never return home. The sisters convinced themselves they were just doing business, but when the rains came in 1964, the earth betrayed their secrets. Bones rose to the surface. Skulls emerged from the mud. The truth could no longer be buried. This is the story of how evil thrives in silence, how power corrupts absolutely, and how four sisters became the nightmare that haunts Mexico to this day. But most importantly, this is the story of the forgotten victims whose voices demand to be heard. What drove these sisters to such unimaginable cruelty, and how many more secrets lie buried beneath Rancho El Angel? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The sun blazed mercilessly over Guanajuato in 1964 as police trucks kicked up clouds of dust on the road to Rancho El Angel. Detective Martinez stepped from his vehicle, surveying the desolate ranch that had become Mexico's most horrifying crime scene. Townsfolk gathered at a respectful distance, whispering prayers and clutching handkerchiefs to their faces. "Over here," called Officer Hernandez, pointing to a patch of disturbed earth. "We found another one." The priest blessed each grave as they were uncovered, his voice trembling with each prayer. Families pressed forward, desperate for closure, calling out names of daughters, sisters, mothers who had vanished without a trace. The morning air filled with the sound of shovels scraping against hard-packed earth and the quiet sobbing of those who had searched for years. Detective Martinez knelt beside a small grave, brushing dirt from what appeared to be the remains of a young woman. In her skeletal fingers, a child's rosary caught the sunlight. His stomach churned as he realized how young she must have been. "How many?" he asked, though he dreaded the answer. 91 confirmed so far," Hernandez replied grimly. "Maybe more. The sisters kept records, but they're incomplete." As Martinez stood, a leather journal caught his eye, partially buried near the ranch house. He lifted it carefully, noting the meticulous handwriting on water-stained pages, names, dates, payments received, a ledger of human misery written in Delfina's steady script. The detective's hands shook as he read the first entry, dated 15 years earlier. The story began not with monsters, but with children who had learned that survival meant abandoning mercy. In the early 1910s, the Gonzalez Valenzuela household echoed with the sounds of hunger and fear. Young Delfina pressed her eye to a crack in the wooden door, watching her father's hand rise and fall against her mother's face. The sharp crack of flesh meeting flesh had become as familiar as the rumble of her empty stomach. "You dare question me, woman?" her father roared, his voice thick with alcohol and rage. "I am the man of this house." Delfina's mother crumpled to the floor, blood trickling from her split lip. She had made the mistake of asking why there was no money for food when he had spent their last pesos on drink. In the Gonzalez Valenzuela house, questions were met with violence. The four sisters huddled together in their shared bed that night, their thin blankets providing little warmth against the cold mountain air. Maria del Carmen, barely 8 years old, tried to muffle her tears. Maria Luisa stared at the ceiling in silence, already learning to hide her emotions. Maria de Jesus, the youngest, clung to Delfina's nightgown like a lifeline. Mama's face looked like the purple flowers by the church, Maria de Jesus whispered. Hush, Delfina said, but her voice was gentle. At 10 years old, she had already learned that softness was a luxury they couldn't afford. Papa drinks because he's angry. Mama makes him angry when she asks for things. Through the thin walls, they heard their mother weeping quietly in the kitchen. Their father had passed out in his chair, snoring heavily. This was their normal, a world where love was scarce and violence was constant. Delfina pulled her sisters closer, their small bodies creating a pocket of warmth in the cold room. She had already begun to understand that in their world, the strong survived and the weak perished. The lesson would shape everything that followed. By the 1920s, the four sisters had grown into young women shaped by hardship. They shared a single bed in their family's crumbling adobe house, whispering dreams and schemes in the darkness after their parents fell asleep. The years had hardened them in different ways. Delfina into a calculating leader, Maria del Carmen into a fierce enforcer, Maria Luisa into a quiet observer, and Maria de Jesus into a follower desperate for belonging. We could leave, Maria del Carmen whispered one night, her voice barely audible above their father's drunken snoring from the next room. Just walk away and never come back. With what money? Maria Luisa asked practically. We'd starve within a week. Delfina stared at the ceiling, her mind working through possibilities. She had watched their neighbors struggle and fail, seen families torn apart by poverty and desperation, but she had also noticed something else. How men paid for pleasure, how women could leverage their beauty into survival. Not if we're smart about it, Delfina said finally. Not if we work together. Maria de Jesus shifted closer to her eldest sister. What do you mean? Delfina turned to face her sisters, her eyes glinting in the moonlight that filtered through their cracked window. I mean, we use what we have. We make men pay for what they want anyway. But we do it our way, on our terms. The sisters lay in silence, processing the implications of Delfina's words. They had all seen the women who worked the cantinas, had witnessed how desperation drove them to sell themselves for scraps. But Delfina's vision was different. She wasn't talking about survival, she was talking about control. We protect each other, Delfina continued, her voice gaining strength. Whatever happens, whatever we have to do, we stay together. We never let anyone break us apart. One by one, the sisters murmured their agreement. In that moment, their bond solidified into something unbreakable and ultimately destructive. The early 1930s brought drought and desperation to Guanajuato, but they also brought opportunity for those willing to see it. Delfina walked through the marketplace with her sisters, her keen eyes studying the flow of men and money with the intensity of a general surveying a battlefield. She paused outside a cantina where men stumbled in and out, their pockets lighter and their faces satisfied. The women who worked there looked tired and worn, their youth already fading despite their young ages. But Delfina saw something else. She saw the steady stream of coins changing hands, the demand that never seemed to diminish. Look at them, she murmured to Maria del Carmen, nodding toward the prostitutes. They're doing it all wrong. What do you mean? Maria del Carmen asked, following her sister's gaze. They're working for other people, giving away most of what they earn. They have no protection, no control. Delfina's voice carried a note of excitement that her sisters had learned to recognize. It meant she was planning something big. That evening, as the family sat around their meager dinner of beans and tortillas, Delfina shared her observations. Their father barely listened, too focused on his bottle, but their mother's eyes grew wide with alarm. Delfina, you cannot be thinking such thoughts, she whispered urgently. Decent women starve, Delfina interrupted, her voice sharp as a blade. Decent women watch their children die of hunger while their husbands drink away their hope. She gestured around their bare room, at the holes in their clothes, at the empty pot that should have held their next meal. This is what decency has given us. Nothing. Maria Luisa nodded slowly, her practical mind already grasping the logic of Delfina's argument. Maria de Jesus looked confused but trusting, while Maria del Carmen's eyes blazed with the same hunger for more that drove their eldest sister. As night fell, Delfina pointed toward the horizon where the lights of the city twinkled like fallen stars. One day, we'll own more than they ever dreamed. By the late 1940s, the sisters had accumulated enough money through various schemes and prostitution to make their boldest move yet. They stood before a ramshackle ranch on the outskirts of Guanajuato, their eyes surveying the possibilities hidden within the crumbling buildings and overgrown fields. "Rancho El Angel," the previous owner said, spitting tobacco juice into the dust. "The Angel Ranch, funny name for such a godless place." Delfina counted out the bills with deliberate precision, her face betraying nothing of the excitement coursing through her veins. This was it. Their chance to build something that belonged entirely to them. No more answering to cantina owners, no more splitting profits with men who contributed nothing but threats. The ranch sprawled across several acres, isolated enough to ensure privacy but close enough to civilization to attract customers. The main house needed repairs, but its thick adobe walls would muffle sounds. The outbuildings could be converted into rooms for their business. Most importantly, the hard-packed earth would be perfect for hiding their mistakes. Maria del Carmen walked the perimeter, her soldier's eye cataloging defensible positions and escape routes. Maria Luisa examined the books, calculating expenses and potential profits. Maria de Jesus simply followed, trusting her sister's judgment as she always had. "We'll need girls," Delfina announced as they gathered in the main house. "Young ones, pretty ones. We'll tell them we're offering work as barmaids or cleaning girls." "And if they try to leave?" Maria Luisa asked. Delfina's smile was cold as winter wind. "They won't. We'll make sure of that." That evening, they shared a bottle of tequila in their new home, the liquid burning their throats like liquid courage. Outside, coyotes howled in the distance, a sound that would soon be joined by more human cries. To Rancho El Angel, Delfina raised her glass, and to never being hungry again. The sisters drank deeply, sealing a pact that would damn them all. The early 1950s brought the first test of the sisters' resolve. A young woman named Elena had arrived at Rancho El Angel 6 months earlier, lured by promises of honest work and decent wages. She was 19 with dark eyes that still held traces of innocence, despite the horror she had endured since her arrival. Elena had tried to adapt, to accept her situation as so many before her had done, but when she discovered she was pregnant, something inside her rebelled. She could not bring a child into this place of darkness and despair. She had to escape. On a moonless night in March, Elena slipped from her quarters and ran toward the fence line, her bare feet silent on the packed earth. Freedom was just beyond those posts, just past the boundary of Rancho El Angel. She could taste it like honey on her tongue. But Maria del Carmen was a light sleeper, trained by years of hypervigilance. She woke to the soft sound of Elena's footsteps and raised the alarm with a sharp whistle that echoed across the ranch. The sisters converged on Elena like wolves on wounded prey. Delfina's face was terrible in its calm fury as she grabbed the girl by her hair and dragged her back toward the main house. "You ungrateful little whore," she hissed. "After everything we've given you, food, shelter, protection, this is how you repay us?" Elena fell to her knees, tears streaming down her face. "Please, I'm pregnant. I can't stay here. I won't make trouble, I swear. I won't tell anyone. Just let me go." The confession of pregnancy changed everything. A pregnant girl was bad for business, and worse, she represented a liability that could expose their operation. Delfina's eyes met those of her sisters, and in that moment, they crossed a line from which there would be no return. Maria del Carmen struck first, her hand connecting with Elena's face with brutal force. Maria Luisa held the girl's arms while Delfina wrapped her hands around Elena's throat. Maria de Jesus watched in horror, but did nothing to stop them. When it was over, Elena lay still in the dirt, her nightgown stained with blood from her broken nose. The sisters stared at the body in the lantern light, each processing what they had done in their own way. "Bury her deep," Delfina commanded, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "And remember, no one must ever know." Within weeks of Elena's death, Rancho El Angel had transformed from a simple brothel into something far more sinister. The sisters had learned that murder was easier than they had imagined, and that the remote location of their ranch made disposing of evidence almost laughably simple. Fresh girls arrived regularly, lured by the same promises that had brought Elena to her doom. They came from small villages throughout central Mexico, daughters of farmers and laborers who saw opportunity in their daughter's beauty. The sisters were careful in their recruitment, targeting girls with few family connections or those whose disappearance might not be immediately noticed. Each new arrival underwent the same process. Their real identification papers were confiscated, for safekeeping, replaced with forged documents bearing new names and fabricated histories. This served multiple purposes. It made the girls harder to trace if anyone came looking, and it helped break down their sense of identity and connection to their former lives. Maria Luisa had developed a particular talent for this psychological manipulation. She would sit with each new girl in the first week, gently but firmly explaining the rules of their new existence. They were no longer daughters, sisters, or individuals with dreams and aspirations. They were property of Rancho El Angel, and their only purpose was to generate income for the Gonzalez Valenzuela sisters. The ranch itself had been modified to serve as both fortress and prison. Windows were barred, doors were reinforced, and the perimeter was patrolled by men loyal to the sisters. The girls lived in cramped quarters, barely fed and constantly watched. Those who showed signs of rebellion were isolated and punished severely. Maria del Carmen took charge of enforcement, her childhood experience with violence serving her well in this new role. She carried a leather whip and wasn't hesitant to use it on girls who stepped out of line. The sound of leather meeting flesh became as common as the morning rooster's crow. By moonlight, the sisters would gather to count their profits and plan their expansion. They had created a machine of exploitation that ran with terrifying efficiency, fueled by desperation and maintained through terror. What had begun as survival had evolved into something monstrous, and with each passing day, the sisters grew more comfortable with their role as predators. By the mid-1950s, Rancho El Angel had become an open secret throughout the region, but it remained untouchable thanks to the sisters' careful cultivation of corrupt relationships. Maria Luisa's ledger read like a directory of local power, documenting monthly payments to police chiefs, judges, and government officials who had all learned to look the other way. The corruption ran deep and wide. Police Captain Rodriguez received 5,000 pesos monthly to ensure that missing person reports involving young women were filed and forgotten. Judge Morales took 3,000 pesos to dismiss any charges that might surface. Even the local priest received donations to keep his sermons focused on spiritual matters rather than earthly injustices. Business boomed as word spread through Mexico's underground networks. Politicians, wealthy ranchers, and military officers made regular pilgrimages to Rancho El Angel, drawn by the sisters' reputation for discretion and their willingness to cater to any desire, no matter how depraved. The girls lived in constant terror, watching new faces arrive while others simply vanished without explanation. They learned not to form friendships, not to hope for rescue, not to dream of escape. The few who tried to flee were brought back as examples to the others. Delfina had grown into her role as the undisputed leader, her word absolute law within the boundaries of the ranch. She dressed in fine clothes now, jewelry glinting on her fingers as she supervised the daily operations of her empire. The hungry child who had shared a bed with her sisters was gone, replaced by a woman who viewed human life as just another commodity to be bought and sold. Maria del Carmen enforced the rules with increasing brutality, her reputation for violence spreading beyond the ranch to serve as a deterrent to anyone who might consider crossing the sisters. Maria Luisa managed the finances with meticulous precision, ensuring that their bribes were paid on time and their profits continued to grow. Maria de Jesus served as a recruiter, her innocent appearance helping to lure unsuspecting girls into their trap. As Delfina counted money by candlelight one evening, she whispered to herself, "No one can touch us now." Outside, the wind carried the sound of muffled sobbing from the girls' quarters. a lament that had become the ranch's permanent soundtrack. The sisters had achieved everything they had dreamed of as children: power, wealth, and complete control over their destiny. They had also become the monsters their father had never quite managed to be. In a small village 30 kilometers from Rancho El Angel, Maria Gonzalez sat by her kitchen window, staring at the road that had swallowed her daughter 3 months earlier. Carmen had been just 17 when she left for what she believed was a job as a barmaid at a respectable establishment. She had promised to write, to send money home, to return for her mother's birthday. The silence had become unbearable. Maria Gonzalez was not an educated woman, but she possessed the fierce intuition of a mother whose child was in danger. She had walked to Rancho El Angel twice, only to be turned away by surly guards who claimed no one by her daughter's name worked there. They suggested she check the cantinas in the city, implying that Carmen had probably run off with some man. But Maria knew her daughter. Carmen was a good girl, devout and responsible. She would never simply disappear without word. As news of other missing girls began to circulate through the village networks, Maria found herself at the center of a growing circle of desperate mothers. They gathered in the church after evening mass, sharing stories and theories, pooling their meager resources to hire men to search. The local police had been less than helpful. Sergeant Martinez had taken their money and promised to investigate, but weeks passed without word. When pressed, he suggested that young women were unreliable, prone to running off with the first handsome face they encountered. But Maria and the other mothers knew better. They began keeping their own records, comparing dates and descriptions, mapping the disappearances that seemed to radiate outward from the same general area where Rancho El Angel sat like a spider in the center of its web. Father Rodriguez tried to offer comfort during his sermons, speaking of God's mysterious ways and the importance of faith during trials. But his words rang hollow to mothers whose children had vanished without trace. One evening, as Maria knelt before the altar, lighting candles for Carmen, she made a vow that would sustain her through the dark years ahead. She would never stop searching, never stop asking questions, never let her daughter's memory fade into the convenient silence that seemed to surround Rancho El Angel. The wooden cross she carried had been carved by Carmen's father before his death 2 years earlier. Now it served as both prayer token and weapon, a reminder that love could be as persistent as evil, and sometimes more powerful. The late 1950s marked the height of Rancho El Angel's power and influence. The sisters had expanded their operations beyond simple prostitution into a complex network of exploitation that served Mexico's elite with whatever perversions they desired. The ranch had become a destination for those whose wealth and position granted them immunity from conventional morality. Governor Ruiz arrived monthly in his official car, the state's seal on the door reflecting the setting sun as he conducted his inspections of the facility. Senator Valdez brought foreign dignitaries who wanted to sample Mexico's more exotic offerings. General Herrera used the ranch to reward his most loyal officers, turning brutality into currency within his command structure. The girls who survived long enough learned to recognize the important visitors by their clothes, their cars, and the deference shown to them by the sisters themselves. These men were untouchable, their desires absolute law within the confines of Rancho El Angel. Refusal was not an option, and resistance meant death. Delfina had grown sophisticated in her role as hostess to power. She wore imported dresses and spoke in cultured tones, playing the part of a successful businesswoman rather than the architect of systematic murder. She kept detailed records of her clients' preferences, using their secrets as insurance against potential prosecution. The parties grew more elaborate and more depraved. What had once been simple transactions became theatrical productions designed to satisfy increasingly twisted appetites. Girls were forced to participate in elaborate scenarios, their trauma entertainment for men who had grown bored with conventional pleasures. Maria del Carmen supervised these events with military precision, ensuring that every detail met the exacting standards of their elite clientele. Her reputation for discretion had spread throughout Mexico's power structure, making her indispensable to men who could not afford scandal. During one particularly lavish celebration, a young woman named Isabella broke free from her captors and burst into the main party, her torn dress and bloodied face shocking the assembled dignitaries. Before she could speak, Maria del Carmen struck her down with a brass candlestick, the girl's skull cracking, with a sound that momentarily silenced the room. "Gentlemen," Delfina announced calmly, "please continue your enjoyment. This minor distraction has been resolved." The party resumed as if nothing had happened, while Isabella's body was dragged away to join the others in the ranch's hidden cemetery. For 3 years, a fragile normalcy had settled over Rancho El Angel's operations. The sisters had perfected their system of recruitment, exploitation, and disposal, creating a sustainable business model built on human misery. Their wealth had grown exponentially, allowing them to live like aristocrats, while their victims suffered in conditions worse than any prison. The ranch itself had undergone extensive renovations funded by their bloody profits. The main house now boasted fine furnishings, crystal chandeliers, and artwork stolen from the possessions of murdered girls. The sisters dressed in imported fabrics and genuine jewelry, their transformation from poverty-stricken peasants to wealthy businesswomen complete. They had even begun to believe their own propaganda, convincing themselves that they were providing a valuable service to society. They housed unwanted women, gave them purpose, and satisfied the needs of important men who kept Mexico running. In their twisted logic, they were patriots and philanthropists. Delfina held court in her private office each morning, receiving reports from her lieutenants and making decisions about the day's operations. She had developed a particular fondness for a small vial of arsenic that she kept in her desk drawer, using it to eliminate girls who had become too troublesome to manage through conventional intimidation. The poison was cleaner than violence, more sophisticated than beating someone to death in the mud. It allowed the sisters to maintain their veneer of respectability while removing obstacles to their continued success. Girls who died from poisoning could be passed off as natural deaths from disease or accident. Maria Luisa had become an expert in creating believable cover stories for these deaths, forging medical documents and bribing coroners to avoid uncomfortable questions. The paperwork was always perfect, the explanations always plausible to anyone who didn't look too closely. But their sense of invincibility was about to be shattered by a single act of desperate courage. A girl named Rosa had been planning her escape for months, carefully observing the guards' routines and identifying the weakest points in the ranch's security. On a night when rain obscured the moon, Rosa finally made her move, slipping past the sleeping guards and running into the darkness with nothing but the clothes on her back and a story that would bring down an Behind her, Rancho El Angel continued its operations, unaware that their perfect system was about to collapse around them. Rosa ran through the night like a soul escaping hell, her bare feet cut and bleeding from the rocky ground, her lungs burning with each desperate breath. Behind her, the lights of Rancho El Angel faded into darkness, but the memories of what she had witnessed would haunt her forever. She had been at the ranch for 8 months, long enough to see dozens of girls arrive and disappear. She had watched Maria del Carmen beat a pregnant girl to death, witnessed Delfina poison a woman who had tried to organize the others in resistance, seen Maria Luisa calmly record the murders in her ledger as if they were business expenses. The worst part was not the killing itself, but the casual indifference with which the sisters treated human life. They discussed murder over breakfast, planned tortures while counting money, and slept peacefully while girls sobbed in the darkness around them. Rosa had almost given up hope when she noticed that the guard posted by the eastern fence sometimes dozed after midnight. It had taken weeks of careful observation to confirm the pattern, and even longer to work up the courage to attempt escape. Too many girls had tried and failed, their screams echoing across the ranch as examples to the others. But Rosa was different. She had grown up on a farm and knew how to move quietly through darkness. More importantly, she carried with her the memories of her younger sister, who had been murdered by the sisters 3 months earlier. Anna had been only 15 when she arrived at Rancho El Angel, and 14 when she died trying to protect another girl from Maria del Carmen's whip. Rosa stumbled through the darkness, following the North Star toward the distant village of San Miguel, where she prayed someone would listen to her story. Her dress caught on a barbed wire fence, tearing away a piece of fabric that would later be found by investigating police. But she pressed on, driven by desperation and the need for justice. As dawn broke over the mountains, Rosa collapsed at the feet of Father Martinez, outside the church of San Miguel. The priest took one look at her condition, the cuts, the bruises, the terror in her eyes, and knew that he was witnessing the beginning of something that would shake the foundations of their community. "Help me," Rosa whispered, her voice barely audible. "They're killing girls at Rancho El Angel. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds." Father Martinez had served the parish of San Miguel for 23 years, but nothing in his experience had prepared him for Rosa's testimony. He sat in his small office behind the church, writing furiously as the girl recounted horrors that challenged his faith in human nature. Rosa spoke for hours, her voice growing stronger as she unburdened herself of months of suppressed terror. She described the systematic torture, the casual murders, the way the sisters had perverted their ranch into a factory of death. Most disturbing were the details about the clients. Powerful men whose names Father Martinez recognized from newspapers and political broadcasts. "They keep books," Rosa whispered, her hands trembling as she accepted the cup of warm milk the priest offered. "Maria Luisa writes down everything, how much each girl earned, what the clients paid for, how each one died. She has it all recorded like a merchant's ledger." The priest's hand cramped as he struggled to capture every detail. This wasn't just a story of individual evil, it was evidence of a vast conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of Mexican society. The corruption Rosa described explained how the sisters had operated with impunity for so long. "Father, you have to believe me," Rosa pleaded, seeing doubt in his eyes. "I know it sounds impossible, but I lived it. I saw my sister die. I watched them bury her with the others." Father Martinez set down his pen and looked deeply into Rosa's eyes. He saw truth there, raw and undeniable. More than that, he saw courage, the kind of bravery that would be needed to bring this nightmare to light. "I believe you, child," he said quietly, "and with God's help, we will make sure the world knows what happened at Rancho El Angel." But first, they needed proof. Rosa's testimony alone would not be enough to overcome the sisters' wealth and connections. They needed evidence, documents, other witnesses willing to speak despite the danger. Father Martinez reached for his coat, his jaw set with determination. "We're going to the authorities in Guanajuato, not the local police. They're corrupt. But there are still honest men in this world, and we're going to find them." As they prepared to leave San Miguel, neither of them realized that Maria del Carmen was already organizing search parties to find Rosa. The sisters knew that a living witness represented an existential threat to their empire, and they would stop at nothing to silence her permanently. The rainy season of 1963 brought torrential downpours that had been building toward this moment for over a decade. Captain Mendoza of the Guanajuato State Police had received Father Martinez's report 6 months earlier, and the investigation that followed had slowly gathered momentum, despite pressure from corrupt officials to abandon the case. Rosa's testimony had been the key that unlocked a conspiracy of silence. Other survivors had been found, women who had escaped over the years but had been too terrified to speak until they realized they were not alone. Their stories corroborated Rosa's account in horrifying detail, painting a picture of systematic brutality that shocked even hardened investigators. The captain stood in the rain outside Rancho El Angel, watching his men mark positions on their hand-drawn map with increasing dread. Each X represented a grave, each grave a life stolen by the Gonzalez Valenzuela sisters. The rain had exposed what drought and deliberate concealment had hidden for years. "Sir, we found another cluster near the north fence," Sergeant Lopez called out, his voice strained. "Looks like at least 5 bodies, maybe more." Captain Mendoza walked carefully through the mud, noting how the recent floods had turned the ranch into a grotesque archaeological site. Bones protruded from eroded hillsides, skulls emerged from washed-out gullies, and fragments of clothing fluttered from exposed roots like macabre prayer flags. The sisters had chosen their location well, The remote ranch was perfect for hiding evidence under normal circumstances, but nature had betrayed their secrets, washing away years of careful concealment to reveal the true scope of their crimes. Dr. Ramirez, the forensic specialist brought in from Mexico City, crouched beside one of the more recent discoveries. "This victim was young," he announced grimly. "Probably not more than 16. Cause of death appears to be blunt force trauma to the skull." As the day wore on, the map filled with marks until it resembled a military battlefield diagram. 91 confirmed graves with strong evidence that many more remained undiscovered. Each mark represented someone's daughter, sister, or friend who had vanished into the darkness of Rancho El Angel and never returned. Captain Mendoza folded the rain-soaked map carefully, treating it with the reverence it deserved as evidence of Mexico's most horrific crime. Tomorrow, they would arrest the sisters and begin the process of seeking justice for the nearly 100 women who had died in their private hell. The floodwaters continued to rise throughout the night, and by morning, the true horror of Rancho El Angel lay exposed under the gray sky like an open wound in the earth. What had begun as a standard missing persons investigation had transformed into Mexico's most shocking mass murder case. Captain Mendoza arrived at dawn with a full forensic team, photographers, and enough body bags to handle what they feared they might find. The rain had stopped, but the damage was done. Mother Nature had become an unwitting ally in the pursuit of justice, revealing secrets that human corruption had protected for over a decade. As investigators worked to catalog the remains, a pattern emerged that made their task even more heartbreaking. Many of the victims had been barely more than children when they died. Dr. Ramirez found evidence of systematic torture, malnutrition, and medical neglect that spoke to the deliberate cruelty of their captors. "Captain," called Officer Juarez from near the eastern fence. "You need to see this." Mendoza approached carefully, noting the small skull that protruded from the muddy bank. Beside it, a child's hair ribbon fluttered in the morning breeze, its bright yellow color a stark contrast to the brown earth surrounding it. "She couldn't have been more than 13, Dr. Ramirez observed, his professional demeanor cracking as he examined the remains. Malnutrition, evidence of repeated physical trauma, and what appears to be a fatal blow to the back of the head. The ribbon had somehow survived burial, preserving a fragment of the girl's identity long after her name had been forgotten. Someone had tied it in her hair with care, perhaps a mother preparing her daughter for what she believed would be honest work and a better life. As news of the discovery spread, crowds began gathering at the gates of Rancho El Angel. Families who had searched for missing daughters for years finally had confirmation of their worst fears, but also a terrible kind of relief. At least now they knew. Maria Gonzalez stood among them, clutching her wooden cross as investigators carried another body bag past the entrance. She had never stopped searching for Carmen, and now she feared she was about to receive the answer she had dreaded for so long. The yellow ribbon would become a symbol of the case, reprinted in newspapers throughout Mexico as evidence of the youth and innocence that had been destroyed at Rancho El Angel. March 15, 1964, dawn crisp and clear as Captain Mendoza's team surrounded Rancho El Angel in the pre-dawn darkness. The investigation had taken months to organize properly, with careful coordination required to avoid alerting corrupt officials who might warn the sisters of the impending raid. The captain checked his watch and signaled to his men positioned around the perimeter. They had one chance to capture the Gonzalez Valenzuela sisters and secure the evidence needed to ensure their conviction. Too many powerful people had invested in keeping Rancho El Angel's secrets buried to risk a failed operation. At exactly 6 o'clock a.m., police vehicles roared through the ranch's gates while officers on foot moved through the fields to prevent escape. The sisters had grown complacent after years of immunity, and their guards were overwhelmed within minutes of the assault beginning. Delfina was captured in her bedroom, still wearing silk pajamas and jewelry worth more than most families earned in a lifetime. She fought like a wildcat, screaming obscenities and threats about the powerful men who would destroy anyone who dared arrest her. Maria del Carmen barricaded herself in the ranch's armory, firing warning shots until tear gas forced her surrender. Even in custody, she radiated the cold violence that had made her the sisters' primary enforcer for so many years. Maria Luisa was found calmly burning documents in the ranch's office, trying to destroy evidence of their financial records and client lists. Her systematic destruction of files continued even as officers restrained her. Her practical mind focused on limiting their legal exposure. Maria de Jesus was discovered hiding in the cellar with several terrified girls who had been chained there for weeks. The broken shackles found in that underground prison would become some of the most damning evidence against the sisters, proof of the systematic imprisonment that had preceded so many murders. "Get to those girls' medical attention immediately," Captain Mendoza ordered, his voice tight with anger as he surveyed the conditions in which human beings had been forced to live. The girls who were rescued that morning were barely recognizable as the young women who had arrived at Rancho El Angel months or years earlier. Malnutrition, disease, and psychological trauma had reduced them to shadows of their former selves. As the sisters were loaded into police vehicles, Delfina managed one final act of defiance, spitting at the crowd of investigators and shouting, "We only did what men have done for centuries. We just did it better." The courtroom in Guanajuato had never seen a case like the prosecution of the Gonzalez Valenzuela sisters. Judge Herrera presided over proceedings that captivated Mexico and horrified the international community. Journalists packed the gallery while sketch artists worked furiously to capture every moment of what newspapers were calling the trial of the century. Prosecutor Valdez had spent months preparing his case, interviewing survivors and cataloging evidence that painted a picture of systematic brutality unprecedented in Mexican criminal history. His opening statement lasted 3 hours as he methodically outlined the sisters' crimes, each detail more shocking than the last. "The defendants," he declared, gesturing toward the 4 women seated at the defense table, "operated a killing factory disguised as a business. Over the course of more than a decade, they lured nearly 200 young women to Rancho El Angel with false promises of employment and legitimate work." The sisters sat unmoved throughout his presentation, their faces masks of indifference that chilled observers. Delfina wore an expensive black dress and maintained perfect posture, as if she were attending a social function rather than facing judgment for mass murder. Defense attorney Morales attempted to argue that his clients were victims of circumstances, driven to extreme measures by poverty and abuse in their own childhoods. The strategy fell flat when confronted with the overwhelming evidence of premeditation and the sisters' obvious enjoyment of their crimes. Rosa took the witness stand on the 3rd day of testimony, her voice strong and clear as she recounted the horrors she had witnessed. The courtroom sat in stunned silence as she described watching her sister Ana die, the casual way the sisters discussed murder, and the systematic dehumanization of their victims. "They kept books," Rosa testified, her eyes fixed on Delfina's face. "They recorded everything, how much each girl earned, what clients preferred, how each one died. They treated us like inventory, not human beings." Maria Luisa's ledgers were introduced as evidence, their meticulous entries providing a roadmap of the sisters' criminal enterprise. Each page contained names, dates, and monetary amounts that reduced human lives to accounting entries. When it was her turn to speak, Delfina rose from her chair with regal bearing and addressed the court with chilling composure. "We survived in a world that gave us nothing. If that makes us criminals, then convict us. But remember that every man in this room has paid for what we provided." The judge's gavel echoed through the silent courtroom as he called for order, but the damage was done. Delfina's words had exposed the hypocrisy that enabled their crimes, while revealing the complete absence of remorse that defined her character. The sentencing hearing took place on a gray morning in November 1964, exactly 8 months after the discovery of the mass graves at Rancho El Angel. Judge Herrera had spent weeks reviewing testimony and evidence before reaching his decision, weighing the unprecedented nature of the crimes against the limitations of Mexican law. The courtroom was packed beyond capacity as he prepared to deliver judgment on the 4 sisters who had terrorized central Mexico for over a decade. Families of victims filled the front rows, many clutching photographs of daughters, sisters, and mothers who would never come home. "The court has reviewed extensive evidence," Judge Herrera began, his voice carrying the weight of history. The defendants have been found guilty of 91 counts of murder in the first degree, multiple counts of kidnapping, human trafficking, and operating a criminal conspiracy. Delfina remained motionless as the judge continued, her face betraying no emotion even as he detailed the systematic nature of their crimes. Maria del Carmen stared at her hands, perhaps finally grasping the magnitude of their fall from power. Maria Luisa took notes even during her own sentencing, her practical mind still functioning despite their circumstances. Delfina Gonzalez Valenzuela, Judge Herrera announced. This court sentences you to life imprisonment without possibility of parole. Your crimes represent a level of calculated cruelty that has no precedent in Mexican legal history. Similar sentences were handed down to each sister, ensuring that none would ever again taste freedom. The courtroom erupted in applause and tears as families finally received the justice they had sought for so many years. Outside the courthouse, Rosa spoke to reporters about the long journey from that night she fled Rancho El Angel to this moment of vindication. Justice has been served, she said quietly. But it cannot bring back Ana or any of the others. We must remember them not as victims, but as daughters who deserved better than what this world gave them. Maria Gonzalez held her wooden cross close to her heart as she watched the sisters being led away in chains. After years of searching and hoping, Carmen's fate was finally confirmed. Her daughter had been among the first victims. Killed during the sisters' early experiments in murder, one survivor whispered to her companion as the crowd dispersed. Justice, even when it comes late, is still justice. Today, we can finally say their names were not spoken in vain. The sentencing document would be preserved in Mexican legal archives as evidence of the day when evil finally faced consequences for its actions. Prison life proved difficult for women accustomed to absolute power and luxury. The Gonzalez Valenzuela sisters were housed in separate facilities to prevent them from conspiring together, their criminal partnership finally broken by concrete walls and steel bars. Delfina was sent to Santa Marta Acatitla, Mexico's harshest women's prison, where her imperious manner and violent history made her a target for both guards and inmates. She attempted to maintain her authority through intimidation and bribery, but without her sisters and their criminal empire, she was just another aging convict with delusions of grandeur. On a cold morning in January 1968, prison guards found Delfina's body in the construction yard where she had been assigned to work. A load of cement blocks had shifted during delivery, crushing her beneath their weight. The official report classified it as an industrial accident, but inmates whispered about the divine justice of Mexico's most notorious killer being buried under the very material used to build prisons. Maria del Carmen received news of her sister's death with characteristic stoicism, showing no emotion as the warden delivered the information. She had been assigned to kitchen duty at her facility and spent her days preparing meals for women whose crimes paled in comparison to her own. Her own death came a year later during a prison riot that she had helped instigate. According to witnesses, Maria del Carmen was stabbed 17 times by inmates who had learned about her role in the Rancho El Angel murders. She fought until the end, her legendary violence serving her one last time before she collapsed in a pool of her own blood. The deaths of the two eldest sisters were reported in Mexican newspapers with minimal fanfare, their passing treated as the end of an era of corruption and brutality. Editorial writers reflected on how the Gonzalez Valenzuela case had exposed the rot within Mexico's political and law enforcement systems. Maria Luisa and Maria de Jesus remained in their respective prisons, their careful records and quiet obedience earning them better treatment than their more volatile siblings. They rarely spoke of their crimes and showed no interest in appeals or parole hearings. News reports described them as the last remnants of Mexico's most notorious murder partnership, women whose names would forever be associated with systematic cruelty and the abuse of power. Their deaths, when they eventually came, would mark the final chapter in a story that had shocked the nation and changed how Mexico viewed organized crime. The newspaper clipping reporting Delfina's death would be saved by historians as evidence of how even the most powerful criminals eventually face judgment. whether from human courts or the cruel justice of fate. The years following the sisters' convictions brought a gradual process of healing to the communities that had lost so many daughters to Rancho El Angel. Families organized memorial services, erected markers in village cemeteries, and worked to ensure that their loved ones were remembered as more than just statistics in a criminal case. Maria Gonzalez had become an unofficial leader of this effort, using her experience searching for Carmen to help other families navigate the painful process of grieving for children whose bodies might never be found. She worked with authorities to identify as many victims as possible, comparing dental records and personal effects with the remains discovered at the ranch. The site of Rancho El Angel itself had become a pilgrimage destination for families seeking closure. The buildings had been demolished by court order, but the graves remained, marked now with simple wooden crosses bearing whatever names could be determined from the sisters' incomplete records. Father Martinez had been instrumental in creating a memorial garden where the main house once stood. Local craftsmen donated their labor to install a stone placard listing the names of identified victims, while space was left for future additions as more identities were confirmed. "We remember," the memorial inscription read, "not the evil that was done here, but the lives that were stolen. May their names be spoken with love, and may their stories teach us vigilance against those who would prey upon the innocent." The annual Day of the Dead celebrations had taken on special significance in the villages surrounding the former ranch. Families would gather to place flowers on the memorial, share stories about their lost daughters, and ensure that new generations understood the importance of protecting the vulnerable. Rosa continued to speak publicly about her experiences, traveling throughout Mexico to educate people about the warning signs of human trafficking and exploitation. Her testimony had helped convict the sisters, but her real mission was preventing future tragedies by teaching others to recognize danger. "Evil thrives in silence," she would tell audiences, her voice strong with conviction. "But when we speak truth, when we remember the victims, when we refuse to forget, that's when evil begins to lose its power." The memorial placard became a symbol of this resistance to forgetting, a permanent reminder that the nearly 200 women who died at Rancho El Angel had been more than victims. They had been daughters, sisters, friends, and dreamers whose lives deserved to be honored and remembered. The 1980s brought the gradual conclusion to the Gonzalez Valenzuela story as the surviving sisters aged and died in prison obscurity. Maria Luisa, always the most practical of the four, had managed her incarceration with the same methodical approach she had once applied to managing the ranch finances. She kept detailed journals during her imprisonment, documenting prison life with the same obsessive record-keeping that had characterized her role in their criminal enterprise. These writings, discovered after her death, provided insight into the mind of a woman who remained unrepentant, even after decades behind bars. "The weak always blamed the strong for their suffering," she wrote in one entry dated 1982. "We provided services that men demanded. If society chooses to criminalize supply while ignoring demand, that is hypocrisy, not justice." Her death came quietly in 1984 during her sleep, prison medical records indicating heart failure brought on by years of poor health and advancing age. She was 68 years old and had spent 20 years in custody, her practical mind finally silenced by the mortality she had inflicted on so many others. Maria de Jesus, the youngest and most impressionable of the sisters, outlived her siblings by 6 years. Prison psychologists described her as withdrawn and possibly suffering from severe depression, though she refused all offers of counseling or therapy. She spent her final years working in the prison library, organizing books with the same quiet efficiency she had once applied to following her sister's orders. Inmates who worked with her remembered her as polite but distant, never speaking about her past or showing any interest in forming relationships. When Maria de Jesus died in 1990, she was the last link to the era when Rancho El Angel had terrorized central Mexico. Newspaper obituaries were brief and factual, noting her death as the end of Mexico's most notorious criminal partnership. The prison identification cards belonging to both sisters were preserved in criminal archives as evidence of how justice, however delayed, had finally been served. Their deaths passed without public ceremony or mourning, marking the end of a story that had begun with 4 hungry children making a pact in poverty and ended with their corpses buried in unmarked prison graves. Historical records would show that the Gonzalez Valenzuela sisters had been responsible for at least 91 confirmed murders, with evidence suggesting the actual number approached 200. Their names joined the ranks of history's most prolific killers, but their victims' names lived on in the hearts of those who refused to let them be forgotten. Decades after the demolition of Rancho El Angel, the site had transformed from a place of horror into a symbol of remembrance and education. Local historians had worked to preserve the story, ensuring that future generations would understand what had happened there and why it must never be allowed to happen again. The land itself had been donated to the community and converted into a memorial park where families could gather to honor their lost loved ones. Native trees had been planted to provide shade for the memorial plaques, and walking paths connected the various monuments erected throughout the grounds. Children from the surrounding villages would sometimes dare each other to visit the site after dark, whispered legends growing around the graves and the ghosts that supposedly wandered there. But older residents treated the place with solemn respect, understanding that it represented real tragedy rather than supernatural entertainment. Elena Jimenez, a local teacher who had lost her aunt to the sisters' crimes, organized annual educational visits for students throughout the region. She would stand among the memorial crosses and tell the story of Las Poquianchis, emphasizing the human cost of corruption and the importance of speaking out against injustice. "Evil is not supernatural," she would tell her students. "It is very human, and it grows when good people choose silence over action. The women who died here could have been your sisters, your mothers, your friends. They were killed not by monsters, but by people who chose greed over conscience." The weathered photograph displayed in the Guanajuato Historical Museum showed Rancho El Angel as it appeared during the investigation. Broken buildings, disturbed earth, and evidence markers scattered across ground that had hidden so many secrets. The image served as a stark reminder of how evil could hide behind ordinary facades. Rosa, now an elderly woman, still visited the memorial annually on the anniversary of her escape. She would place flowers on Anna's marker and speak quietly to her sister's memory, sharing news of her life and expressing gratitude for the strength that had carried her through the darkness. "I lived," she would whisper, "and because I lived, your story was told. Because your story was told, justice came. And because justice came, other girls might be saved." The transformation of Rancho El Angel from killing ground to Memorial Park represented more than just the passage of time. It symbolized the community's determination to transform tragedy into teaching, ensuring that remembrance would serve as protection against future evil. Every November 2nd, on the Day of the Dead, the memorial site at the former Rancho El Angel became a gathering place for one of Mexico's most solemn and beautiful traditions of remembrance. Families traveled from throughout central Mexico to participate in ceremonies that honored not just their own lost loved ones, but all the women who had perished at the hands of the Gonzalez Valenzuela sisters. The tradition had begun spontaneously in the years following the trial, when Maria Gonzalez and other grieving mothers had come to place flowers and light candles at the mass grave sites. Over time, it had evolved into an organized annual observance that combined mourning with celebration of the victims' lives and lasting impact. Local artisans crafted special candle holders from clay taken from the ranch grounds, their simple beauty contrasting with the horror that had once defined this place. Each holder bore the image of an angel, transforming the ranch's ironic name into a symbol of protection for the innocent. As darkness fell on the Memorial Day, hundreds of candles flickered throughout the grounds, their light creating a constellation of remembrance that could be seen for miles. Children who had never known the victims personally stood alongside elderly grandparents who still grieved for lost daughters, united in their commitment to keeping memory alive. Father Rodriguez, now ancient but still serving his parish, offered prayers for the souls of the departed and guidance for the living. His words carried the weight of decades spent comforting families and seeking meaning in senseless tragedy. "We light these candles," he would say each year, "not to chase away darkness, but to prove that light endures. Each flame represents a life that mattered, a story that deserves telling, a name that will not be forgotten. Rosa, accompanied by her own grown children who had never known their Aunt Anna, would share stories of life at Rancho El Angel with younger visitors. Her testimony had helped convict the sisters, but her ongoing mission was ensuring that their crimes served as education rather than just history. Young people who attended the ceremonies often asked why such horror had been allowed to continue for so long. Their questions sparked discussions about corruption, inequality, and the social conditions that made exploitation possible. The candlelight vigil always concluded with a reading of names. Every victim who had been identified through dental records, personal effects, or family testimony. Some names were followed by brief biographies shared by surviving relatives, while others were simply spoken into the night air with only their age and hometown for context. As the ceremony ended and families began the journey home, they carried with them the knowledge that love had indeed outlived fear. Present-day Rancho El Angel stands as a testament to memory's power over evil. Its memorial gardens and educational center ensuring that the Gonzalez Valenzuela sisters' crimes continue to serve as lessons for new generations. The site receives visitors from throughout Mexico and around the world, people drawn by the need to understand how such systematic evil could have operated unchecked for so long. The memorial's visitor center displays artifacts recovered from the ranch, photographs of identified victims, and testimonies from survivors like Rosa, who continued sharing her story until her death in 2019 at the age of 86. Her final public appearance had been at the memorial's 50th anniversary commemoration, where she reminded attendees that vigilance remains the price of protecting the innocent. University students studying criminology and social work make regular pilgrimages to the site, using the sisters' case to examine how poverty, corruption, and gender inequality create conditions that enable exploitation. The memorial has become a classroom where abstract concepts of justice and human rights take on visceral meaning. A guest book in the visitor center contains thousands of entries from people moved by their encounters with this history. Children write simple promises to be kind to others, while adults reflect on their responsibility to speak out against injustice in their own communities. One entry, written in careful handwriting by a teenage girl from Mexico City, captures the continuing relevance of the memorial's message. I never knew that evil could hide behind normal faces, or that good people could choose to look away. I promise to remember Maria and Carmen and Ana and all the others whose names are written here. I promise to listen when people need help and to speak up when I see wrong being done. Their deaths will mean something if we learn from their suffering. Local schools have incorporated the Rancho El Angel story into their curricula, teaching students about the warning signs of human trafficking and the importance of reporting suspicious activity to authorities. Teachers emphasized that the sisters' victims were ordinary girls from ordinary families, making the tragedy both more relatable and more preventable. The memorial wall now contains nearly 200 names, as ongoing research has helped identify additional victims through advanced forensic techniques and family DNA testing. Each new identification brings closure to families while reinforcing the staggering scope of the sisters' crimes. On quiet afternoons, when no ceremonies or school groups are scheduled, the memorial grounds provide space for private reflection and remembrance. Visitors often comment on the peaceful atmosphere, noting how completely the site has been transformed from its horrific past into a place of beauty and hope. The final words carved into the memorial's central monument capture the enduring message of this dark chapter in Mexican history. The sisters' names are remembered in horror, but the women they silenced are remembered in love, and love will always outlive fear. These words serve as both epitaph for the victims and warning for the future, ensuring that the darkest impulses of human nature remain illuminated by the light of memory and the promise of justice. The story of Las Poquianchis continues to resonate because it exposes universal truths about power, corruption, and the vulnerability of those society chooses to ignore. The Gonzalez Valenzuela sisters began as victims themselves, children shaped by poverty and abuse into instruments of evil. Their transformation from desperate survivors to systematic killers serves as a cautionary tale about how unchecked power corrupts and how silence enables atrocity. But the lasting legacy of Rancho El Angel is not the evil that flourished there, but the courage of those who brought it to light. Rosa's desperate flight through the darkness, Father Martinez's determination to seek justice, Captain Mendoza's refusal to be corrupted, and the families who never stopped searching for their lost daughters. These acts of bravery ultimately triumphed over years of systematic cruelty. The memorial stands as proof that memory can outlast evil, that truth can overcome corruption, and that love, however delayed, however painful, will always prove stronger than fear. In remembering the women who died at Rancho El Angel, we honor not just their individual lives, but the eternal human capacity to resist darkness with light, to answer hatred with love, and to transform tragedy into hope for future generations. Their names live on, spoken each year by candlelight, carried forward by those who refuse to let them be forgotten. And in that remembrance, evil loses its power to triumph, ensuring that the victims of Las Poquianchis achieved in death what they were denied in life: the dignity of being known, mourned, and forever remembered as daughters of Mexico, who deserve so much better than the fate they received.